Welcome to the Chief of Cybersecurity podcast, where we discuss relevant information concerning the cybersecurity workforce, business development, and best practices, made possible by CMIS. Learn more at cmis.net. And for a list of authorized publications, visit DewayneHart.com. And now, here's your host, Dewayne Hart.
Well, we made it again to the Chief of Cybersecurity podcast. Season 2 is developing very well. I always like to say that cybersecurity is a very challenging and critical ecosystem. And within the ecosystem of cybersecurity, there's this many programs from risk management to incident management to security engineering, looking at your governance, risk, and compliance. But there's one other program which is called vulnerability management. When we think of vulnerability management, it's about closing those loopholes, because the combination of risk itself means that there are threats and vulnerabilities on your enterprise. So threat time vulnerabilities equals risk. But for this podcast, we are going to be discussing vulnerability management and looking at how a vulnerability management program is designed. And it's called developing end-to-end vulnerability management process, because there are some intricate pieces that go along with the entire program. It goes beyond scanning, because scanning is the initial part of the program. And I remember when I first started off in this cybersecurity industry, I was working on a vulnerability management project. And the scope of that project was that I had to identify ways to clean up application vulnerabilities. Let's say, for instance, if you had an application like Java and it was out of date, then I had to deploy patches. But also, too, I had to scan different servers and try to identify where vulnerabilities exist. So for this podcast, we really want to deep dive into vulnerability management. But to be successful, it's starting off by talking about vulnerability management and giving a practical definition. But then I want to break down a vulnerability management lifecycle process. Not so much just looking at scanning, but also too looking at the identification area, looking at the prioritization, your patching, remediation, and your reporting and continuous scoring, and then bringing it home and talking about what have I experienced, because I've been a part of this industry for a while, then rolling into best practices. Because for a program to be effective, you're always going to have some different changes in those particular industries. So let's go deep dive and talk about vulnerability management and what is vulnerability management. Vulnerability management is a systematic way of managing vulnerabilities that you have. If you think about an organization that has over 1,000 servers and you have these different vulnerabilities that occur on a monthly basis, it can be anything as far as your security patches need to be installed, because Microsoft always releases its patch Tuesdays around the middle of the month. And then during that patch Tuesday, you can identify some vulnerabilities that actually exist on your servers. But the challenging part is, how do you remediate all those vulnerabilities? Because there are some intricate pieces that go along with a vulnerability management program that needs to be in place. And one of those is policies. Like, you always have to have a policy in place, because the policy is going to identify that governance strategy or pretty much how you want to carry out your vulnerability management program. One of the other areas that actually operates as well too is that your configuration management database. This seems to be the centralized problems for many of the vulnerability management programs because organizations struggle to identify what assets that they have on their enterprise. Because if you think about an organization that has 100,000 assets, and a lot of these assets are being taken off of the enterprise, and a lot of these assets are pretty much reaching their end of life cycle, and then you have newer assets that are brought on to the enterprise, well, your inventory may not be correct. So that's why you rely on an effective configuration management database. Your compliance tools like Tenable Nexus, using Qualys, using any of the other type of scanning tools are very important, but some of these tools are very sensitive because they don't work on certain enterprise as of now. Tenable has a line of compliance tools. There is Tenable.io, there's Tenable EP, there's Tenable SC. I've actually worked on all three of those platforms, and they are similar in so many ways, and then, they are different. Then your patch and vulnerability remediation is a critical element as well too, because this is where you're going to go through your patch cycle. So as you scan your environment and you have a list of vulnerabilities on the enterprise, well, the next step is that you have to identify what actually should be patched. And sometimes you have to go through these very long analysis process. And as you go through these analysis process, that's when you can identify what actually needs to be remediated. Let's just say, for instance, if it's an issue with Java, and let's say if Java states, okay, well, we found 1,000 vulnerabilities for Java over like all of your servers on your enterprise. Well, as an organization, then you're going to have to do the analysis and figure out exactly the prioritization on what needs to be remediated first. And so you have a lot of organizations that struggle on this because of the fact is that it's so many vulnerabilities on these enterprises. And if you don't have any type of tools that can do this for you, then what you end up doing is doing it manually through using an Excel worksheet. I've actually used Excel a lot to go make pivot tables and come up with metrics and numbers and try to identify what actually needs to be patched first. But then there are critical moments where you may get an advisory from the Department of Homeland Security for typical emergency patching or critical vulnerabilities that you have to add into your risk scoring. And then you have to look at those and see exactly which ones need to be remediated first. And you have a lot of organizations that call it a burn down because there's 1 million vulnerabilities and you got to burn those numbers down to probably about 400,000. Then you have your risk scoring, and a lot of these tools will give you your risk scoring. For instance, if you're using Tenable Nexus, there's a VPR score that you can use from like 1 to 10, and it will assign the criticality rating on certain vulnerabilities, and the organization can actually make a decision on about which ones is most important. And then your continuous monitoring is where you have a continuous engagement into a lot of these assets and trying to identify what you actually need to remediate. Some of the outcomes that you're going to have from a vulnerability management program is that you're going to be able to track remediation, you're going to be able to prioritize risks, and also, too, you're going to be able to see your asset coverage. The asset coverage is the number of assets that you have in your enterprise. And also, too, you can integrate your vulnerability management program into your GRC and your ITSM program. One of the other areas, too, is that you can see where your overall maturity resides on the enterprise. And also, too, you can take a look at the system state, and you can see whether you're compliant or not. If you think about all the vulnerabilities that can exist from different applications, maybe it's network settings, maybe you have different changes that you have on the enterprise. One of the ways I always like to look at brand new assets and just trying to making sure that you follow a baseline, because if you don't follow the baseline, and if you create an image with about let's say if it's like 1,000 assets, and if you put vulnerabilities on the inside of those images, then what happens is that you have 1,000 assets that are now vulnerable. So this is part of that proactive thinking, is that a lot of times it's best to just deploy the bare minimum on your baseline and then go back and rescan and to add on different applications. So let's deep dive into the vulnerability management process. And the first stage is your identification stage. Through this identification stage, you're going to be trying to discover what actually assets do you have on the enterprise, because you want to look at your coverage. Some of the other things like your SaaS, your DAS, and your pen testing also too are going to serve as input to your identification stage. You're also going to be creating scanning schedules, because you have to create your schedules based on the different type of OS systems that you have, Windows, Linux, and if you scan printers, then also too you have to look at printers. And certain organizations like to just do a full network scan and not separate their scans up based on different OS type. Now that's fine. Now there's nothing wrong about that, but the organization has to make sure that the strategy works for their organization. Think about the emergency advisories, because when there is an emergency, the organization needs to decide on what is most important, because that is part of your identification stage as well. As stated before, your configuration management database is very important. I've always believed in the fact that if you get your configuration management database out of line, there are going to be multiple problems in your enterprise, because your configuration management database feeds you the number of assets, and it also identifies all your assets on the enterprise. For my listeners, I am going to do a definition here. When I state the word assets, I am merely talking about all of these devices that are scanned: laptops, servers, printers, kiosk devices, phone systems, and any type of device that you have attached to your network. So we call those assets. Certain tools such as Tenable Nexus, Rapid7, and other vulnerability management tools are going to be giving you input. So when these tools give you inputs, they're going to be used to scan. So what you have to do is that you have to configure them appropriately. And as I get down through here and start to talk about some of the best practices, I am going to identify some of the faults I've seen with those tools as well. So your next stage is going to be your prioritization. This is after you do a scan, you're going to have to identify, okay, what should I start first? Should I start on my Windows devices? Should I start on my printers? Or should I just rely on common math? And common math is stating that you do your analysis and you find out that you got 5,000 issues for like one vulnerability. And so you start there. There's no right or wrong way. It's just that an organization has to make sure that their strategy is consistent. And I'm going to state that again. Make sure that your strategy is consistent, because the same strategy that you use to identify your priorities for like your Windows, where you want to use that same strategy for your Linux as well too, because what you're trying to do is to drive the numbers down. Okay. So you have to create a strategy in these different areas, and also you have to combine your strategies together. All right. Artificial intelligence integration is very important as well, too, because it speeds up your prioritization process. If you think about organizations that have 300,000 assets, those organizations cannot rely on the human eye at least to be too accurate. So what we need is some robotic software, and that's where artificial intelligence come in, because it can speed up the data analysis and it kind of give you a view into where you need to start first. Think about the threats that you have. Think about your CVEs scoring, because the CVEs scoring is just a metric that is going to tell you exactly, your common vulnerability that you have on your enterprise is that rating. Now, organizations can actually use these ratings on the inside of the tools, or you can create your own ratings, or like I've seen organizations that actually create their own weighted factor scores. All right. So an organization can approach this in different manners, but the prioritization is based on the organization and what actually helps most. Some of the prioritization is that you got to do your analytics, and you can use Excel or Power BI or like some other type of analytical tool. I've seen organizations use tools like Brinker. Brinker is a real good tool that would take numerous data feeds, and it will analyze the information, and it'll give you a view based on your prioritization. Now that you have done your prioritization, now it's time to patch and remediate. When you patch and remediate, keep in mind that operating systems, applications are pretty much going to be included. And also, too, that your patch and remediation strategy has to relate to your prioritization. Because if you stated that Windows KB 67879 is like most important, then, well, you need to start there as well. And your burn down metrics, because you always have to have metrics that's going to show your effort and your fixed state. One of the areas that needs to be thought about, too, is your authentication rates, because your authentication rates are going to show you whether you had a successful scan or whether you have a credential access to a device. Because if you cannot remotely connect to a device, then, your numbers are going to be off. And I always state your numbers, because when you scan a device and you patch that device, well, you want to see what was fixed. But if you cannot fully authenticate to a device, then your vulnerability scanner is not going to be to actually see what was fixed. So the idea is to make sure that your authentication rates are high. Think about your patch cycles, where you patch on Mondays for Windows device, on Tuesdays where you do Unix devices. Rescanning should occur, especially if you're trying to see what was fixed. Some of the other areas is your SLAs and your exceptions, because if you're not able to fully remediate a vulnerability, then maybe you need to set up an exception, because your SLA states, well, if it's a critical 1, 2, 3, or 4, then, well, you have so many days or weeks or months to correct that vulnerability. Let's say, for instance, if it's a critical check, it may state you have 3 days to like patch the issue. But if you can't patch it in 3 days, maybe you need to file for an exception. Make sure that you communicate with your system owners, because the system owners know these systems well. And Patch Tuesday is always available for us as well, too, because as Patch Tuesday come out, it's going to tell us exactly what we should patch. Now, imagine that you just went through this patch cycle, and so you patched all of these devices. And now what needs to happen is that you need to do your reporting and also your continuous monitoring. What you get out of your reporting and your continuous monitoring is your gap analysis. When you think about a gap analysis, well, that's 100,000 vulnerabilities but see, I only fix 50,000. All right. So you got a serious gap there. Gaps are the things that are not occurring. One of the ways that you can help your reporting on as well too is that you can use things such as PowerShell, or if you have someone that can program using Python, then you can create maybe a proprietary dashboard that can use APIs to go pull data from the backend database of these scanners, and it just goes to the database table and it pulls that data for you, and it does all your data analysis. Power BI is really good with that as well too. Your vendor websites are really good as well too, because they're going to help you out as far as your reporting. Some of the other features too is automated deployments are very important, especially if you have large reports that need to be deployed every week. Some of the other areas too is that you need to have some team communication, because your team needs to be communicating amongst each other, because if they're not communicating, then you're going to have teams such as the Unix team and the Windows team maybe stepping over each other's boundary, because everybody needs a certain time of the week or the month to patch. And if you don't have a maintenance schedule set up, and if there's no communication amongst your teams, then you could have a lot of problems. And as far as your reporting, some of these reports can actually be done manually, but automated reporting is definitely a whole lot better. Now, with that said, I have been around vulnerability management for a while, and I've seen a lot of problems. And I'm going to tell you some of the things that I have experienced. One is there is no continuous process, which means organizations do not scan on a frequent basis, maybe only when they think they should scan. There is no RACI chart. Now, what a RACI chart does, it shows you all the responsibilities for your vulnerability management program. It actually going to have your responsible people and who is accountable and who consulted and who is informed. Because with all these different teams that you have, maybe it's your networking team, your system admin team, maybe it's your governance team. Everybody plays a role in this vulnerability management program, so you need to have a RACI chart in place as well. One of the other thing is the volume of known vulnerabilities is overwhelming and can lead to focus on high severity vulnerabilities only. Yes, if you're in an enterprise and if you get behind on your patch management program, you can cause your vulnerability numbers to grow. And as these numbers start to expand, now what happens is the organization has to play catch up, and it creates a backlog. So with a backlog in place, you're always going to be trying to perform ahead, and counting that Patch Tuesdays happens at the middle of the month. Sometimes you may not be able to exceed of your goals. So if you get behind because you are concentrating on one area more so than the next area, then you may have problems. Now, I'm not saying that you need to take your high severity vulnerabilities and you push them to the side. I am stating that there needs to be a balanced approach. Let's go green is one of the problems too. Let's go green happens because organizations choose to take printers off the network so that their metrics can go in the green. Because imagine that if an organization scored a 90%, then they would look very effective in the eyes of the CISO. All right. But you say, okay, then, well, we're only at 85%. But, if we take these 20 printers off of this report, we can score 90%. Going green seems good, but the overall risk is still there because you still have printers that are vulnerable. No training on analysis is one of the issues as well, too. How do you analyze that data? Spreadsheets are really good, but but not everybody is savvy at using spreadsheets. That's why I always state that if you can automate the process, then it'll help out a lot. One of the other areas, too, is prioritization. Trying to decide on what you should patch and fix in an order of sequence of what is important seems to be one of the problems that I've seen in the industry as well, too. And that can be relieved by having a continuous strategy about your risk prioritization. No continuous approach, proactively engage vulnerabilities before incidents. Very important, because a lot of times you can find vulnerabilities prior to incidents happening, and you should have a continuous approach where you can find those vulnerabilities and to remediate them. Poor communication. Teams don't speak to each other. They only talk when something fails. And you have a lot of teams that say, hey, my servers need to stay online. But you have a vulnerability management team states that we need to patch it. Now you get a lot of bad communication and teams that are in fighting amongst each other. Asset inventory, I've already said that before. If you have an accurate asset inventory, it could be a bad business. Bad data in equals bad data out. That is your configuration managed database. If you do an asset discovery, and if, for instance, you are inputting end of lifecycle systems and you scan the environment and your authentication rate goes down, it's because these end of lifecycle systems cannot be scanned. And see, that can affect your metrics a whole lot. Here goes some best practices. Best practices are always good. Perform a proper discovery. Assess all layers of the enterprise. So that means printers need to be included on your scans. Determine asset ownership. Asset ownership means that through your configuration managed database, you should know who owns server A, B, or C. And if you don't know that, then it creates problems, because those are the groups that you speak to when it comes to remediating vulnerability. Create a RACI chart. Everyone has a responsibility, but the RACI chart will lay out the responsibility. Track your trends and your reporting. Effectively track your trends and your reporting. Some of these compliance tools has a dashboard, and then a lot of times you can do this on a spreadsheet. Develop a functional patch vulnerability and remediation plan, because you need to have that plan in place. Because with that plan in place, you're going to be able to identify how to carry out a vulnerability management process. No fixed patches. Okay. Sometimes I've seen people that do not fix patches. I've seen patches that have been on the enterprise for 2, maybe 3 years, but, they haven't been fixed. And it's because certain applications such as Java, you can have older versions of Java on your enterprise. And if you don't patch those older versions every quarter, it's going to flag it as a vulnerability. So the only way to remediate that issue is that you can remove the older versions, or you can update to the most latest version and hope it cleans up some of the older version. Risk scoring is very important too. Make sure that you practice proper risk scoring. Some of the other things here is practice proactive security. Proactive means that Patch Tuesday comes out, and go ahead and do your scans, and go ahead and keep an accurate list on your vulnerabilities on your enterprise. Some of the other things, too, is that in the cybersecurity mindset, make sure that you stay close to situation awareness, risk-based approach, and also digital modernization, because these are 3 areas that focus on a vulnerability management program. Because situation awareness is saying that you understand the enterprise, because you know the IP address and the scope of the enterprise, and you know how servers operate. And as far as the risk-based approach, you're going to be extending your compliance mentality over into a risk-based state. Just because you scored a 90%, that doesn't mean you stop, because you have to continually try to engage this vulnerability management program and try to fix your issues. So as you see through this podcast, there are some intricate pieces that go along with a vulnerability management program. it can work, but it requires an in-depth effort from like many teams and many other players to actually be involved. Because when everyone is involved, that's when you can pinpoint your issues on the enterprise. And as you pinpoint these issues on the enterprise, that's when you reduce your risk scoring. This is when you can do a burn down. This is when you can reduce those vulnerabilities. But so keep in mind that those authentication rates are very important. Your prioritization is very important. And what I identified in these stages here as far as your identification and your risk prioritization and your patch and vulnerability remediation and your reporting, this is just one way of trying to design the stage. I've seen other organizations that has 6, maybe 7 stages. But for the premises of vulnerability management, those are some of the stages that actually have to be in place. So as you continue to channel your cybersecurity career, keep in mind that vulnerability management has to stay active, and also, too, that vulnerability management is going to serve you well. All right? So I will see everybody in the next episode, and you stay close to your cybersecurity mindset.
You've been listening to the Chief of Cybersecurity podcast, where you have gained relevant knowledge to enhance your cybersecurity mindset. Be sure to visit DewayneHart.com to learn more about authored publications, show notes, and discover more information concerning cybersecurity.